Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could make it. I'm really excited that one of our own members has decided to do some research and lead us on a deep dive into the maple family. And, I'm not going to make any announcements about what's coming up because with Track It Forward, you can all look on there and see there's something for everyone every day. But I am really pleased. And Paul, I will just turn it over to you. And if anyone has any questions, Paul would prefer that you type them into the chat.
Yeah.
And then we'll go over those at the end.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I wanted to say at the beginning that I've given lots of talks on medical topics, particularly in my field of pediatric endocrinology, but this is the first talk that I've prepared on a non-medical subject. And the way I got to doing this talk is that a while back, Nora asked me if I would be in charge of continuing education for this year for the Treat Stewards group. And I said, well, that sounded nice. And that I got to, in that role, pick the topics and try to find the speakers. Well, you might recall that I wanted to do one on oaks, and it turned out that the experts on oaks that I found online were charging $500 to $800 to talk to us for an hour about oaks. And so we did have a speaker on oaks. We had Rod Simmons, who gave a talk about protecting oak diversity in Northern Virginia. But I decided that, to do stuff that's different than what, we do at our training sessions when we talk about right tree, right space, and things like that. And I decided that I'd like to see talks focusing on a specific family of trees. And since my favorite family is the maples, I figured, well, for free, I could give a talk based on my researching the maples on the internet. And so I do not profess to be a true expert. And when you ask questions, if I do not have an answer, I will try to look it up and get back to you. But so what you're hearing tonight is what I've been able to find about maples that I thought would be of interest to share. And I thought I would start by, I thought I would start by talking about the origins of maples. So it turns out that maples are pretty old. They originated when the dinosaurs were still flourishing over 100 million years ago. And most people think that they originated in central China. But the oldest fossilized maple leaves that have been found were found in Alaska. Early maples had simpler structure, 3-lobed leaves, and they spread mainly in the northern hemisphere. But during the Ice Age, 2.5 million years ago, they spread south, especially in Central Asia and in North America. But today, there are more than 125 distinct maple species, but only 13 are native to North America. And none of them are south of the equator, very few south of the equator. So maples belong to a highly diverse group of angiosperms, and they had differentiated from their ancestors by the beginning of the Cretaceous period. And this is a time when the earliest flowering plants were spreading across the globe, competing with previously dominant woody gymnosperms such as pines, cypresses, and ginkgos. But it was during the next geological period that we call the Paleogene that maples split off from their relatives among the flowering plants and truly became their own family. So by the beginning of the Paleogene, about 66 million years ago, global climate was hot and wet, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on the average than global temperatures in the recent past. And under these conditions, the trees that would give rise to modern maples became distinct. And the fossil evidence shows that recognizably maple-ish leaves and fruits finally began to appear. And it was at this point that maples diverged from other genera in the soapberry or Sapindaceae family. So as I mentioned earlier, China is the evolutionary cradle of maples. They could have come from North America over the land bridge, but I think most people agree that they originated in maples, and then they radiated across the entire Northern Hemisphere during the wet, warm period of our planet. Now, what is the soapberry or Sapindaceae family? The Sapindaceae occur in temperate to tropical regions, many in laurel forest habitat throughout the world. Many are lactiferous, meaning they contain latex, a milky sap, and some contain soap-like chemicals called saponins. But the largest genera of this family are the Sergania, the Paulinia, the Allophilus, and the Acer. So it also encompasses horse chestnuts and buckeyes and lychee. So horse chestnuts, buckeyes, and lychees are actually very close, even though they look nothing like maples, they are the closest relatives. And I found this very hard to believe, that the horse chest is the closest living relative of maples. Now, you might think that sycamores or plane trees might be related to maples because their leaf shape is similar, but they are not closely related. Now, I was actually hoping that I could find somewhere on the internet a maple sort of family tree showing which species are most closely related to others, but could not find any. Could not find that. What I did find is some pictures of early maples that had the 3-lobed leaves found instead of the 5-lobed, mostly 5-lobed leaves found today. And they evolved into a diverse group of species, both monoecious plants with male and female parts on a single plant, and dioecious plants with 2 separate sexes. So how did maples do when the world started cooling? Well, roughly 50 million years ago, the Earth entered a long period of gradual and intermittent global cooling, and we would still be cooling if it were not for anthropogenic climate warming that we're experiencing. But the decline in global maple diversity with climate cooling and drying was not uniform. So in the East Asian maples have been protected by the geographic diversity and relatively stable climate of the region. And Asia now includes the native range of about 80% of today's maple diversity. But the maples of Europe and North America have been much more vulnerable to climate cooling, which has frequently led to glaciation in both Europe and North America. So at the height of the recent ice age, when glaciers reached well into the northern United States, and much of what we now think of as forest land was probably devoid of tree cover. But during this time, sugar maples and box elders migrated deep into Central America. And then as the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, they returned to North America. So this map shows the current distribution of maples. And you can see that they're pretty well distributed throughout North America and into parts of Canada, well distributed pretty much in every part of Europe. And then in Eastern Asia and the islands north of Australia, but very little maples south of the equator. So what traits define maple trees? Well, leaf arrangement and shape and seed type are the best way to identify a member of the genus. The appearance of the bark, as I'll show you a little while, is not a good way to identify maples. So all maples are deciduous and broadleafed. And as Nora has pointed out during our tree training, they have opposite leaves, which sets them apart from many other species. Most have simple palmately veined leaves with anywhere from 3 to 13 lobes, and giving rise to the classic maple leaf shape that we know and love. But not all maples fit this pattern. There are 2 surviving lineages which have developed compound leaves. These include the North American box elder in one lineage, and the East Asian paperback and Nikko maples in the other. But another defining characteristic of maples is that they all produce paired samaras, or dry winged fruit. So what are samaras? They are the distinctive seeds that we also call maple keys, helicopters, whirlybirds, or polynoses. And they occur in distinctive pairs, each containing 1 seed enclosed in a nutlet attached to a flattened wing of fibrous papery tissue. And they are shaped to spin as they fall. And if it's windy, they carry the seeds a considerable distance. So if you have paired samara in a tree, it will generally identify it as maples, particularly if the tree has opposite leaves. So here's one example of a samara, and this is from the red maple. And in this case, you notice that the angle of the samaras is pretty acute, but other maples like the Norway and sugar maples have a much wider angle of the samara. And it turns out that these samara are a good source of foods for birds, squirrels, and other small mammals. So let's talk now about some of the common maples that you will find in our area. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the sugar maple, also known as Acer saccharum, a favored native tree celebrated for its symmetrical beauty, brilliant fall foliage, sweet syrup, and hardwood. It does best in small towns and suburbs, including parks, yards, and campuses. And they've been a major feature of New England towns and villages for nearly 300 years. They do not thrive on big city streets as they are affected by pollution, sun scorch, and fungus. And they can grow 40 to 70 feet high and 2 to 4 feet across in urban areas, but in woodlands, they can get up to 100 feet, where it competes well with other trees. So the leaves are very easy to distinguish from other maples because they have these U-shaped indentations between the lobes. They have pretty yellow flowers in spring, which I'll show you in a minute, and this intense orange color in the fall. So the leaves are 4 to 6 inches long, 3 to 5 lobes, coarse teeth. And this is a classic shape of a mature tree. It has a nicely rounded crown and spectacular fall color. But before we leave sugar maples, just mention their economic benefits. Indigenous North Americans were harvesting maple sap long before the colonists arrived. Today, the industrial process involves miles of tubing to carry sappy water from trees to stainless steel evaporators. It takes 16 quarts of sap to make 1 pint of maple syrup. But sugar maple is also prized for its strong, beautiful, and lustrous wood that is used for furniture and wood crafts. And many think that the Latin word for maple, which is Acer, may have come from AC or ac, an ancient word for sharp associated with sharp maple pikes. So now I am going to turn from sugar maples to the maple that we probably know the best, which is the red maple or Acer rubrum. They have the greatest natural north-south distribution of any North American tree. And as I'll show you in a minute, They range from lower Canada to Florida. They're a common tree on lightly trafficked streets, yards, and parks, beloved for their red flowers and samaras in the spring and its fall colors. And the leaves are easily identified by their three major lobes and V-shaped indentations. And this is a picture of a red maple on the grounds of the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria that I took a couple of years ago, which I thought was particularly striking. So here's the distribution in the wild, which I mentioned. You can see they managed to even get up into the maritime provinces of Canada and all the way down to Florida. And it can thrive on a very wide range of soil types, textures, moistures, pH, and elevation, more so than any other forest species, which obviously would explain its generous distribution. And it also has the widest tolerance to climate conditions. One of the things that they mention is that it's hard to identify maples by their bark. And I found that, whereas older maples have bark that has these, cracks and fissures, younger maple can have relatively smooth bark. So do not rely on bark to identify a red maple. But as Nora mentioned earlier, one of the things going on with red maples is that there are a lot of cultivars. And one of the ones that is heavily planted in our area, particularly in Alexandria, is a variety called Red Sunset. It's extremely hardy in all but the northernmost reaches, but it also excels in heat due to its drought tolerance. It's a medium fast grower, reaching heights of 45 to 50 feet. And in winter and early spring, it produces these really nice clusters of small red flowers with red samara, and then dark green leaves in summer and vibrant orange red leaves in the fall. But I learned from Matt Devert, who runs the South Riding Nursery, that there's another very popular red maple cultivar that one should think about growing if one wants to pick out a red maple, and that's called October Glory. And it doesn't, I look at this and I say it doesn't look any different from the Red Sunset, but it has glistening dark leaves in spring, radiant red in late fall, and that the colors last for several weeks. It has showy red fruit, which attracts the birds and other wildlife, and it is tolerant of many soils. So both October Glory and Red Sunset seem to be preferred to the native red maple. So now I will turn to another maple, which is familiar, and that is the silver maple, or Acer saccharinum. It's native of moist eastern soils, and it grows rapidly in cities, frequently reaching heights of 50 feet in only 20 years, and they are great shade trees. The leaf blades have 5 lobes, and most of you are aware that it's easy to recognize because it's the only maple with such deeply cut indentations. And it's medium green on the top and pale silver on the bottom. And they're also characterized by short trunks divided with massive limbs forming a Y-shaped crown and a flattish top. And here is a couple of silver maples in our area, but that I photographed. And you notice that how many branches, how many large branches it forms. And that creates let's talk about the bark. After you've seen a number of these, the bark is pretty easy to recognize because it's silver gray and it peels in vertical strips. But silver maples are controversial. And while it was planted widely by earlier generations because of its quick growth, in fact, I found that DC planted 11,000 in just 1 year in the 1883. Most urban foresters have put it on their list of trees to eliminate from tree planting. And the reason is that the wood is hard but brittle, and too much wind or a crushing ice or snow load will cause limbs to snap. And its double or triple subtrunks, which I showed you, may simply crack apart under stress. It's also prone to diseases and pests. It develops cavities, and its aggressive surface roots can play havoc with sidewalks and sewers, as I'm sure you've noticed on our streets. Some people have suggested that if you would just prune them at an early age so that they would have one dominant trunk, it would make them safer. But it appears that most urban foresters do not want to face liability and lawsuits. And, you know, I once was creating a database of trees planted in Alexandria in the late 80s and 90s, and silver maple were, you know, on the list back then. But now when you see sugar maples around, it's generally speaking the older trees. There are very few young sugar maples that you'll find. Now we will talk about Norway maples. And Norway maples are felt to be the most common urban maple. And it gets its name from the top of its natural range in Europe. They didn't originate in Norway, but they grow as far north as Norway. And they're popular because they provide ample summer shade, and many cultivars provide bright spring and fall color. The leaves usually have 5 lobes spread like a hand with sharp tips at the end of the major veins. And you'll notice that unlike the sugar maples, which have the rounded space between the lobes, the Norway maple has a sharp space. But one of the tricks to identifying Norway maples, if you break a leaf or a leaf stalk and they exude a white sap, that pretty much identifies it as a maple, as a Norway maple. The wings of the samar are widely spread, up to 4 inches wide. So unlike the red maple, which has very narrow pairs of wings, the Norway maple has very widespread wings. So the Norway, and they stay on the tree until fall. But it appeared in the US by the mid 1700s. And for an introduced species, it has proved remarkably suited to our urban areas. Over the years, over 80 cultivars have been developed to meet local tastes and conditions. And, you know, some of you may have seen a tree with maple-shaped leaves, but they're maroon colored in the summer, not like a red maple. And that's probably a cultivar called Crimson King. And Norway maples are better able to cope with natural pests compared to other street maples, except for the Asian longhorn beetle, which it's susceptible to. So why do we consider Norway maples invasive? Well, you know, I wondered about this because, you know, when you see them planted on the street, they seem to behave. But once they get into the woodlands, they grow faster than native maples and other forest trees. And it outcompetes sugar maples because of its dense canopy and its ability to grow in shade. Also, it has a dense, shallow root system that makes it difficult for native seedlings to get established. And for these reasons, many cities and towns will no longer plant Norway maples. Box elder, also known as Acer negundo, is North America's only native maple with more than a single leaf blade per stalk. And the leaf stalk branches into one or more pairs of opposite substalks with a total of 3, 5, or 7 blades. It forms a disheveled crown, often supported by multiple trunks. So it's been appreciated, though, for being fast growing and drought and cold tolerant, and was once planted along the streets in many cities, including DC, Dallas, Chicago, Denver, and Seattle. It's also known for its large bunches of samara, whose wings form tight angles, and its varied leaf shape. Today, it's been supplanted by more shapely and colorful trees, less prone to falling limbs and insect pests, but one source says it still deserves a place in the woodsy and scruffy areas of town. And what Vince, our Arlington urban forester, said is, we've planted some of them in parks. They're a little too unstable for street tree planting, but they're a great wildlife tree. While we're talking about street trees, back in 2020, when Nora had us, research a topic, I researched the issue of, what street trees were common in our area, and I found a website. It's Urban Forestry Virginia Tech website, and I got some figures based on a 2012, so it's 10 years old, street tree assessment project that the Virginia Tech Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation did. So Arlington at that time had over 20,000 street trees, and red maples were the second most common street tree in Arlington. And it was 10% of the trees, but 13% of the canopy, which tied it for number one. Silver maples were less common, but actually were tied were fifth in the percentage of tree canopy, because every silver maple has more tree canopy than your average tree. In Alexandria, red maples are even more popular, with 15% of trees and 16% of tree canopy, both ranking number one. And silver maples rank number 5 in terms of, so this is trees and this is tree canopy. So red and silver maples are both pretty common trees in our area. So now I think I've covered the native trees that we see, and I would like to now talk about some of the non-native trees found in our area. I mean, everybody has seen Japanese maples everywhere. These are just a few random pictures of Japanese maples. They're native, not surprisingly, to Japan, as well as Korea, China, Mongolia, and parts of Russia. And there are more cultivars than we could ever count, and they've become popular since the 1800s. They all have deeply dissective leaves, and they typically don't grow above 20 to 30 feet. In their natural habitat, they are understory trees, but most cultivars prefer part shade, part sun, and some will tolerate full sun. They are considered particularly suitable for borders and ornamental paths because the roots are compact and not invasive. We don't plant them as street trees, but they're very popular on lawns and in gardens. Another non-native tree that you'll sometimes see is called the Amur maple, also known as Acer genala. It's a pretty multi-trunk tree with low branches, which grows to 15 to 20 feet and has good fall color. Again, native to Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and China, but they thrive in a wide variety of climates. As you can see, the leaves are divided into 3 narrow lobes with toothed edges. So you shouldn't confuse this with the red maple. I have seen some of them in Arlington where they can be used as a patio tree, a hedge, or a living screen. And on a walk not far from the condo where I live, I found an Amur maple just north of, growing on the sidewalk just north of Quincy Park. Now, another non-native maple is the field maple, or Acer campestre, native to much of Central and Southern continental Europe, Great Britain, Southwest Asia, and North Africa. It has been introduced into the US in areas with suitable climate, where it is often known as the hedge maple. And what's notable about it is that the leaves have 5 blunt, rounded lobes with smooth margins. So it's really the only maple with rounded lobes. And I was walking recently in Alexandria on Reineker's Lane, which is just off Duke Street, near the Whole Foods, if any of you get that way. And there was an entire row of field maples on that one street. Now, another non-native maple is the trident maple, or Acer burgeraneum. And it's again native to China, to Asia, China and Japan. The leaves have a very simple trident shape, as you can see, and an interesting flaky bark. It's not planted widely in our area, but as I think I shared with our listserv in the past couple of years, there's a whole stretch of it planted along the Potomac Yards path trail in Alexandria. And paperbark maple, or Acer griseum, is a smaller maple which grows to 20 to 30 feet. And Vince Verwey says it's suitable for planting under power lines because it doesn't grow very tall. He says it's a nice non-native option. So I reached out to Vince to say, I'm giving a talk on maples. What can you tell us about maples in Arlington? And Vince said that red maples have been overplanted, and so they've pulled back significantly on planting them. So instead of having 10% of trees being maples, it's only less than 1%. And his complaint about red maples is that they don't live that long, so they haven't favored them. They will not plant sugar maple because they said they do not believe that it's going to be able to survive long-term climate change. And as far as structural issues are concerned, like many other cities, Arlington is no longer planting silver maple, except in stream restorations, because they're too weak wooded to be reliable in the long term. I want to talk briefly about maple flowers. These beautiful yellow flowers are of the sugar maple. Maples flower in late winter or early spring, with or just after the appearance of the leaves, but in some trees before the trees leaf out. Maple flowers can be green, yellow, orange, or red. Though individually small, the effect of an entire tree in flower can be quite striking, and some maples are an early spring source of pollen and nectar for bees. So flowers are so diverse within the maple genus as to be unhelpful to most casual plant taxonomists. All maples produce regular 5-part flowers with fertilized female flowers, eventually giving rise to the samaras. But they can be all sorts of colors, and maples can be either dioecious or single-sex, or monoecious, having male and female flowers on the same plant. So the maple tree life cycle: in autumn, when the leaves turn colors before dying and falling to the ground, maples go into dormancy. And in the spring, you'll see bright red buds on the branches, which will turn into the flowers. And they're male flowers with stamens that produce the pollen, which is broadcast on the female flower stalks or stigma. The pollination creates 2 seeds for every female flower, and the fruit grows, the samara grows around the seeds. When the leaves come out, the samara start to grow into wings, which are shaken by the wind, and you can see them spinning to the ground. And once they take root in the ground, if it's moist, they will sprout in days into seedlings. I found an interesting article on how to estimate the age of a maple tree. Often we walk by a large tree and we think, wonder if that's a 50-year-old tree or a 100-year-old tree. And there's actually a scientific way to tell. What you do is you measure up the trunk 54 inches, which is probably about the height of your arms, and tie a rope around the trunk. And then use a measuring tape to determine the circumference of the tree. If you divide that circumference by pi, this will give you the diameter. And then you have to multiply that diameter by the growth factor number specific to the species of maple that you have. So for silver maple, you multiply by 3, for red maple, 4.5, for sugar maple, 5.5. Anyway, so to give you an example, let's say you have a red maple and you estimate that it's 4 feet or 48 inches in circumference. You divide the 48 by pi and you get 15.3, then multiply it by 4.5 and you get an estimate of 69 years. So if you're out and see a big maple and you have a tape measure with you, this is a good exercise. Now that I'm just about done, I wanted to make mention of one other issue, and that is maples and climate change. So despite the longstanding knowledge of maples' morphological diversity, ecologists still lack a clear understanding of the diversity in the genus, and we don't know how particular species of maples, as well as other temperate trees, will respond to climate change. Recent studies have already documented some climate-related shifts in maple distribution. But in North America, red maples seem to be increasing in abundance, so due to their ability to tolerate a range of temperatures, while sugar maples seem to be in decline. So can these patterns be generalized across the remainder of the genus? Will those species that already live in warmer and drier climates be favored by our warming and increasingly drought-prone climate? Or are species from cooler, wetter habitats secretly concealing the capacity to put up with a wider range of conditions than indicated by their current distribution? So that's pretty much a summary of what I have found on the internet. And I wanted to acknowledge 2 sources for this talk. The discussion of the particular trees, I lost it. Anyway, the specific, there's a book called The Urban Tree Guide by Arthur Plotnick, which was very good the Urban Tree Book. I would be happy to lend it to people, except it's on my Kindle, but that has a nice discussion of every single tree that you're likely to find in a city. And then the rather long-winded discussion of maple evolution that I tried to explain, although probably not well enough, was from a journal called Arnoldia. It's a publication of the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University, and they had a whole volume to discuss maples. So that is pretty much all that I had to say, and I'll be happy to entertain questions. Nora, were there any questions that came through on the chat? Hello?
Hey, Paul. I have a question.
Yes.
You said something about the Norway maple, but I didn't get a clear sense of where the Norway maple's original habitat was, because I always thought it was not Northern America. I always thought it was somewhere else.
Yeah, no, the Norway maple is a non-native tree. I included it with the native trees because it's so widely dispersed in both our cities and our forests, but it's native to Europe and Asia, and it gets its name Norway maple because Norway is the actual northern, the northernmost part of its distribution.
Gotcha. Thank you.
2 years ago, I actually was in Norway, and we were taking a walk in Oslo, and there was a Norway maple, and I took a picture of it, which I must have, but I would have been great to show you a Norway maple in Norway. But it's native to Asia and Europe.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, let's see, what else was there? I just typed in the name of the urban tree book for people. Oh, I think you covered about the sugar maple not being so great for this area anymore. I will say also that the Tree Canopy Fund planted a lot of sugar maples the first 2 or 3 years, but then we found they just weren't making it, and we began to hear that they wouldn't survive in the coming, so we stopped making them. Oh, here's a funny story about sugar maples though. Whenever we were clearing out Lacey Woods of invasives,
right,
there were a lot of Norway maples. So we were busy pulling them up and hacking them and getting rid of them. And it was Don Walsh and I. And in the fall, Norway maples turn yellow, but so do sugar maples. So we were out there looking at these little seedlings, and we couldn't decide between them. So we didn't want to pull any of them up. And we got the invasives coordinator, who wasn't Jen at that time, to come out. And she looked at them and looked at her book and looked at the backside. And she finally said, you know what? I can't really be 100% sure which they are. So let's let them go and see how they look next year. And they did turn out to be Norway maples, and we got rid of them. Oh, Marilyn, you're muted.
Okay, I can never figure out how to raise my hand. Am I correct? I think about box elders, which are a very scruffy tree, that during the spring, when they put out their stems are growing, they're very green. They're like very, very bright, noticeably green. And they're young stems and their twigs. Is that the box elder?
It could be, but the characteristic of the box elder is the
compound leaves.
The compound leaves on each stalk. And, it's easy to look at them and say, oh, that couldn't be a maple because it's so different. But if you find samaras on a tree with that kind of leaf shape, then it's going to be a box elder. Yeah. Yeah, we found, Nora, I think we found several as we did some of our tree walks around the area. Some of them planted and some of them, just growing in the woods.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something about box elders. The city of Alexandria has planted a few as street trees in Park Fairfax, which I think is fine for diversity. And one way that I think of the box elder leaves, how they look, is it's the tree leaf that is most similar to poison ivy.
Right.
It's often confused with poison ivy.
Yeah.
It does look like it.
Yep. Poison ivy grew in a tree-like form. It would be a tough call.
Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts, stories about favorite maples? You know, I didn't realize that there were so many cultivars of maples, but you know, if you go to a nursery to buy a maple, you're probably not going to be buying a native, but a cultivar, which is bred for its, I don't know, longevity, you know, better. I think the October Glory has a better branch structure. It's less likely to break off during, you know, an ice or snow event than typical red maples. But I find that red maples can, when I was living in Richmond, we had a red maple on our lawn, and every fall we never got a single red leaf. It was completely yellow. So, but I know it was a red maple. So that's how variable the coloration can be. Well, if anybody comes up with other questions, I'm easy.
I don't have a question, but I just have a comment because you know, gosh, it's been several years now since the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute did a study in this, I think the Smoky Mountains and the Appalachians, and found that and predicted that the red maples will be the first ones that go north from here and no longer grow in our area with the heat.
Yeah.
And, you know, they are overplanted. In Park Fairfax, they are. You know, if you have to worry about, well, probably too soon to really worry that they're going to go away fast, but you know, I think it's always good to have a variety too.
Yeah,
I hate all the samaras. I hate all the little ones that come up.
But they're a good source of food for squirrels and small animals. But the fact that red maples have thrived all the way up and down the eastern US suggests that, at least in their genetic makeup, they may have more tolerance of heat than the sugar maple, which is unquestionably going to struggle and either die off or move north. So I think there's reason to hope that the red maple will continue to be one of the dominant trees in eastern forests.
I think those samaras are probably my favorite thing about maples. I remember playing with them as children and putting them on my nose and everything else.
Well, I don't, you know, I don't mind them. I don't mind them, except that when they do grow into little trees, they're plentiful, you know.
Yeah, and then there they are all over your kitchen floor because they get
well, that's not it. You know, living in Park Fairfax, you know, we have so many trees. Yeah, and
it's beautiful.
And it is, except that, you know, then we also, you know, because they cut costs, we don't have as much care of our property as we used to have. And, you know, when we had our in-house crew that did all the work, they would remove volunteers, you know, from gardens. But our mow and blow company that is supposed to do a lot of that work now, or at least twice a year, you know, we have volunteer trees that come up all over the, you know, next to doorways that get left there, you know, and it just, you know, there are a lot of red maples that are that way.
Yeah.
And it helps me. I end up, you know, replanting a bunch of them in pots. And then when they get big enough, I plant them somewhere. But, you know, the red maples are very plentiful in that respect.
Well, I'm going to stop recording now. We can keep talking.
I have one question. I don't know if you want to record questions.